Chapter 8. Facing the Shadow. Delwyn slept soundly that night, and was blissfully unaware that Gwen and Dr. Purdieu were having an in-depth conversation over the phone about her session. The doctor could not sleep, but also couldn't wait to speak to Delwyn's aunt about what had transpired. Even though he'd worked with many schizophrenic patients and those with other conditions, he had never come across someone whose patterns and beliefs were so convoluted and entrenched. He explained it all excitedly to Gwen.
It's almost as though that world and that character, Varun, actually exist. She was so comfortable with the terminology and the history of the place as though it's been around forever.
Gwen hoped that Delwyn had been right when she'd brushed it aside, that the doctor had merely misinterpreted some narcoleptic episodes she'd revealed to him. But here he was, retelling the whole event from go to woe in thrilling detail. She tried to be the sensible one, as everyone had always relied on her for clarity and stability.
Well, she was under hypnosis after all. I've heard stories about false memories, Ellen.
And Delwyn does have a history of astral travel experiences, not to mention her hypnopompic hallucinations.
Maybe you just tapped into some fantastic imagery somewhere in her subconscious and she filled in the gaps, with autosuggestion.
Gwen was no fool, as she'd accompanied Delwyn to many doctor's visits in her life and discussed her niece's medical problems in depth over the years, as well as read quite a lot of articles and books on various subjects dealing with abnormal psychology. Dr. Purdieu couldn't be quietened, as he felt deep down that there were still secrets Delwyn was holding on to. He also had to tell Gwen why he felt that Delwyn needed further testing.
Well, normally I'd agree with you, Gwen, and I'm happy that you're so level-headed, but you didn't see how she was at the end of the session. She looked and spoke so unlike herself, I was shocked to my very foundations. I am not a religious man, but...
He obviously couldn't find the words, or didn't want to sound like a fool.
"What?"
said Gwen, who was starting to wonder about his sanity, and was leaning more and more towards Delwyn's way of thinking.
"She hissed at me. It was surreal, inhuman, almost alien, or demonic."
Gwen could tell that he was shuddering as his breath came out in quiet, shallow, staccato blasts. "Now, come on, Elaine," she chided. "You can't expect me to believe that crap. You're a respected psychoanalyst. You're renowned around the world. I was advised that you are held in very high regard in the world of psychology, which is why I chose to send Delwyn to you, at a very high cost, I might add." He didn't respond with words, as his stammering and confusion got in the way. He obviously knew that fear was taking a grip on him, as he was reliving the twisted face that had been superimposed over Delwyn's, as well as the raspy voice that had assailed his ears. He finally whispered,
"But the voice, the face, they weren't hers."
Gwen scoffed. "Oh, really? I feel like I know more than you, Alan. Haven't you heard about psychosis that is so powerful it can constrict the muscles of a face into something so foreign that even parents can't identify their children in the grip of a psychotic break? It's the same with voices. Anyone can put on a scary voice, Alan. Seriously, what is wrong with you?" Then Dr. Purdieu regained his composure and said the only logical thing he'd said all night.
"Then come and listen to the recording, Gwen. I dare you to ridicule me once you hear it."
She snorted in disgust. "I'll do nothing of the sort. Whatever happened to confidentiality?"
"Her sanity is at stake, Gwen. You must come and hear it for yourself."
He was starting to sound shrill. "No, Ellen, I will not. I know enough about my niece to know that she just needs a little therapy, her medication, and some love and understanding. That will set her straight and on the right path. I suggest you take some time off and get some therapy yourself." She slammed the phone down in a huff, and within seconds it started ringing again. She took it off the hook and went to bed. She was sick of the nonsense and decided that they would find another doctor. Dr. Purdieu, meanwhile, was not happy, but he knew he couldn't do anything without at least Gwen's consent. He thought about trying to contact Dr. Boyd, but that would breach the Privacy Act and he would be seen as a troublemaker. He'd had the recording and he would hang on to it, hoping that soon something would prompt Gwen to change her mind and either come over to listen or convince Delwyn to have further testing. But there was something far more frightening in the back of his mind, festering like a cancer. What if there was something to it? And if there was, what could it be? He shuddered to think, but he saved the file of the recording on his computer as well as his flash drive for safekeeping. When Delwyn woke up the next morning, it suddenly dawned on her that since she'd discovered the dream world, she'd been sleeping soundly. She was still having her narcoleptic problems, but felt that she was in a better position to deal with them. As much as she didn't want to stop the explorations, she was happy to feel more in control and less like a flake, if that was at all possible. She didn't consider that her trips into the mirror were a cause for concern and felt that for the first time in her life she was happy. Regardless of the fact that she was reliant on her aunt and that she was back at square one financially and had zero prospects, she felt that her life was just beginning. She didn't consider herself as disadvantaged, in denial or delusional. It was all good. She felt that hiding the pills was a stroke of genius and that her act the day before had paid off well. Gwen was talking about Dr. Purdieu as though he was the loon, and they laughed about how paranoid he'd been over breakfast. Yes, things were looking up, and she had never felt better. She wanted to try to go straight to the mirror as she felt strong enough to tackle her shadows, in particular her mother. One thing that Dr. Purdieu had said to her did make sense. She had to move dead weight out of the way in order to move on, and her mother was the biggest carcass in her path. It wasn't a possibility, though, seeing as Gwen had advised that she was going to be working near the flat that day to show Greg and Mark the trees that she wanted cut down. They were clearing away the breakfast dishes and getting ready to go and start the milking when there was a knock at the door. She heard her aunt greeting Greg and Mark and wondered why they'd arrived so early. She still had her dressing gown on and her hair was a mess, but she walked over to the entrance hall to say hello. All three of them looked over as she walked towards them, smiling and trying to tidy up her hair. Gwen ushered them into the kitchen and started pouring coffee. She seemed pleased that Delwyn was joining the living, and it seemed as though the session with Dr. Purdieu was a silly nightmare from long ago. Greg threw a cheeky smile Delwyn's way, still obviously taken with her, even though she was quite dishevelled. He started straightening his shirt and tucking it in, but Mark merely nodded in her direction as a matter of courtesy. He didn't bother to smile or even say hello, but then again he was like that with everyone he met. Delwyn wondered why he was always so surly. Even as a child he'd been the uptight wet blanket, telling the other kids not to be silly or stupid when they were playing. He'd always been old before his time, as well as cranky and sour, which was a shame because he was terribly attractive. Women were always throwing themselves at him, but they might as well have been throwing themselves at a robot. "What's going on?" she asked, sweeping her hair off her face. "I told you, love. The boys are going to help with the dead trees next to the old granny flat, but first they're going to help with the milking." To Delwyn's amazement, Mark spoke. "There's no reason why she can't help you with the milking, Gwen. We'll get started with the trees." He pointed his thumb at Delwyn as he spoke, as though she was a thing or a child, which annoyed her immensely. He might as well have come out and said that she was a useless lump of crap, but she wasn't going to allow him to destroy her buzz. However, before she could defend herself, Gwen did it for her. "Well, she has been helping with that, haven't you, Del?" She beamed proudly at her niece. Delwyn raised a smart-ass eyebrow at Mark and said, "Yes, I have, and happy to do so." She held his gaze for a minute, defiant and triumphant, not caring that he shrugged and grunted in response. She did care, however, that Gwen went on to describe her personal problems. "But she is on new medication at the moment, so we have to keep our wits about us, don't we, love?" As soon as she'd said the words, she'd obviously regretted it, pressing her lips together like a naughty child, smiling apologetically at Delwyn. She was stunned, but let it roll off her.
No, it's okay, I can handle it, just let me get dressed. Mark sat down and sipped his coffee, obviously wanting to get on with it, as Greg smiled proudly at Delwyn, and then she ran into the room to change. Gwen yelled out after her, "Okay, love, if you're up to it," apparently feeling bad for her faux pas. 20 minutes later they all walked out into the warm, dark morning, with the sunrise still an hour away. Delwyn quickened her steps to keep up with the men, particularly Mark. Still annoyed by his deferential treatment of her and feeling empowered, she decided that she would set him straight. Gwen didn't bother to keep up or stop her, as she assumed that Delwyn just wanted to be with her friends. As they rounded the corner of the cottage onto the driveway, she pushed between the men and snarled in Mark's ear, "Just a word, mate." Startled, he turned his lapis lazuli eyes to Greg to see if he'd heard, but Greg was smiling and seemed happy to have Delwyn next to him. Mark muttered, "What?" Not caring if Greg heard, Delwyn said flatly, "I need to have a quick word, please." All three of them stopped, Mark and Delwyn facing each other, and Greg a little embarrassed, perhaps due to not knowing what was going on, even though he seemed to have a hunch. Probably feeling like a fifth wheel, he looked behind for Gwen and dropped to the rear, pushing back his unruly hair and throwing a furtive glance at Delwyn. "Don't mind me," he said, pouting in mock rejection. Delwyn winced apologetically. "Sorry, Greg, just 2 minutes, if that's okay." "Sure," he said, obviously a little annoyed and somewhat jealous, but he joined Gwen, who squinted and stopped in her tracks, apparently puzzled as she watched Mark and Delwyn step aside and walk down to the chicken coop. Gwen and Greg walked on to give them privacy, so Delwyn began, deciding to keep it short and sharp. "Look, I know you don't like me, even though I don't know what I ever did to you, but I don't need you sticking your nose into my business or organising my day, okay?" She did her best not to sound shrill and tried to keep her cool, but her pulse was racing, and she realised that since his nasty statement earlier, she'd stopped feeling desire for him. Loathing and anger had taken its place. It was as though Mark had been waiting for this moment, since he pulled his tall frame up even higher in order to lord it over her, not that she was easily intimidated by his obviously macho antics. Putting his fists on his hips, he curled his lip and snapped with his booming yet seething voice, "You need to get your shit together, girl. I don't want you near my brother. He doesn't need a crazy bitch dragging him down, and neither does Gwen." He narrowed his eyes at her to show his contempt. Delwyn was stunned, even though not entirely shocked. She'd assumed that he'd had an attitude towards her in regards to her divorce, but to be so scathing and mean nearly made her cry. She was grateful that her temper shoved the tears back down. "Okay, arsehole," she growled through gritted teeth. "First of all, it's none of your goddamn business whether or not I get my shit together, you prick." She couldn't help calling him names. It felt so good. Mark crossed his arms now and rolled his eyes like a petulant son watching Mummy get drunk again. Delwyn continued with her onslaught. "Second, you are not your brother's keeper. If something evolves between us, then there's nothing you can do about it." Mark interrupted, nostrils flaring and eyes widening, turning a dark, nasty blue, which alarmed Delwyn to a degree. "Now, you listen to me," he roared. "He is my brother, and I have a right to protect him from psycho bitches like you." He pointed his finger angrily in her face, and she slapped it away as she retorted as calmly as she could. "Psycho bitches? What have I ever done that puts me in that category? Not that it's any of your fucking business, you mongrel." She was leaning up and into his face, the last word propelling her into a jeering rage of epic proportions. He pushed her backwards and she nearly fell over but stood her ground. "Get your hands off me!" she yelled with her hazel eyes flaring. Mark was in his element now. He was finally able to hit it where it hurt. Calming his voice down but still seething, he launched his attack. "Oh, well, where should I begin?" He laughed menacingly and rubbed his huge hands together, looking like a hulking caricature of a villain. "You've always been a nutcase, Delwyn, ever since you were a kid. always wanting to escape into fairyland, always shirking responsibilities. I was shocked when I heard that you were going to uni and working and that you left home, but then of course you dropped out and got married, and then you flaked and stuffed that up too, didn't you? Delwyn couldn't believe her ears. How could he be so mean about something so personal? The wounded child in her lashed out. How dare you! As if you can talk, always bossing everyone around, never joining in the fun, never laughing or smiling, always begrudging everyone else's happiness, always having to spoil everything. She charged closer towards him with every sentence, jabbing the air with her finger for emphasis. She realised that he had started stepping backwards. She was on a roll. You're always so fucking jealous, always pressing your nose up against the window, watching to make sure that you don't miss out on your fair share, but you prefer it if you can stop others getting theirs. I bet you go home and whip yourself in penance. I bet you're a flagellant, and you like it, don't you? She liked the evil feeling of twisting the knife and hoped that she was hurting him deeply. Mark stood on the spot now, obviously shocked and dumbfounded. This was not going the way he'd hoped. He'd obviously wanted her to collapse into a puddle of tears the way she used to when ridiculed or challenged. Delwyn went for the jugular. Yes, I remember how mean you were, even as a kid. You enjoyed inflicting pain and probably still do. Who hurt you, Mark? Your parents were always good to you both. Greg turned out fine. What happened to make you such a twisted, sick animal? Mark snapped out of his stupor and erupted. Don't turn this back on me, psycho. Nothing happened to me. I was the one who had to be responsible while you two went and played all the time. It just goes to show how sick you are, that you can say all those depraved things that aren't even true. With that he stormed off, thundering after the others, but then he turned around to yell over his shoulder. And I mean it. Stay away from my brother, you crazy bitch. Delwyn couldn't help it. She ran after him as he turned the corner, meaning to continue her onslaught, but when she got to the road she saw that Gwen and Greg were not far off, pretending to look at the trees that needed to be chopped down. They seemed anxious, and Delwyn didn't want to make the situation worse. But she also didn't want to give Mark the pleasure of seeing her running back to her room in a tantrum. It would make him feel like he had won. Mark charged past them and went to his truck to get his chainsaw, and as Delwyn approached, Gwen walked towards her. Love, I think it's best if you just go back to the house. She tried to rub Delwyn's arm, but she shrugged it off. Why? I'm fine, it's all good. Delwyn watched Mark walk back over to Greg, who was obviously angry with his older brother and wouldn't turn to face him. Gwen looked around and back at Delwyn and said, I think we've had enough drama for today, love. Go on write or something. Delwyn didn't respond, but rolled her eyes and turned to walk back. As she did, she heard the men speaking angrily to each other and Gwen's soothing voice trying to calm them down. On the one hand, she didn't care, but on the other, she felt bad for Greg and Gwen. Mark could go and jump off a cliff as far as she was concerned. As she walked through the back gate and made her way through the herb garden, she decided that she would go on another date with Greg. He was suddenly more attractive to her now, even if some of it was to do with spite. When she got inside, she felt sleepy, so she laid down on top of her covers, not bothering to even take her shoes off. She looked over at the taxidermy case of birds and thought for a minute that a seagull had turned his head to look at her. She sat up and stared at it for ages, but nothing moved, so eventually tiredness took over and she lay back down, finally drifting off to sleep. Then the roaring in her ears began, intense and almost painful. Delwyn knew what was coming, so she held on. A shifting sensation came over her, like static, as she slipped in and out of her body. Then she suddenly shot upwards through her head, like a banana out of its skin, so fast, like a shooting star even. It was always so scary, but exhilarating at the same time, leaving her body. Before she knew it, she was flying through the ceiling, and she could see the fibres of the wood as she penetrated the rafters, each splinter like she was a vapour passing through them. There was nothing more exciting than escaping her body. It was the ultimate freedom.
She felt like she was sleepwalking when in her physical body, or only half awake, but out there in space, free from the shackles of the physical realm, she opened up and became a part of everything. She felt connected to the universe and could sense everything as though her physical body was a sheath that cut her off from the current of the electricity of life. She zoomed over the farm and looked down, seeing Peter chasing a possum. She could see their auras, but felt bad for the possum, so she decided to send a bolt of protective light to cover it. She saw a golden orb shoot out from herself to the possum, and it surrounded him. Suddenly Peter backed off and left him alone. He looked up at Delwyn and she shook a spirit finger at him. She could feel his protesting meow as the possum continued scurrying along to his tree, protected by her energy. She knew to stay away from the roads as she would be sucked up and stuck to the power lines. She flew to where Gwen and Greg were, and they were talking, but she wasn't interested in the subject. Their auras were light green and blue, interchanging with the sharing of information. She flew over to where Mark was, and she sensed him before she saw him. His dark aura was pulsing with dark blue, almost black, and deep red. The tree was dead, but the whole scene was lit up like a dark orange glow, like fire. She knew that it was his angry energy. For a moment she felt pity for him, so she sent him a ball of calm, blue energy. It was absorbed into the seething mass like a drop in a raging ocean. She thought better of wasting any more energy on him. But then for no reason she thought of Dr. Purdieu, and immediately she flew down the highway, speeding like a lightning bolt. She was laughing all over, even though she didn't have a body. Everything was crystal clear and made perfect sense, unlike in the real world. She couldn't articulate it even when she recorded her experiences in her journal, but it was a clarity that she didn't experience in any other realm. When she got to his house, she flew straight through the wall and could see every atom in the plaster. She saw Captain, his little pug dog, who barked excitedly at her. He was usually kept outside but was scampering about as Dr. Purdieu moved boxes of books in and out of different rooms. He seemed harried and preoccupied, definitely not his usual calm and serene self. His aura was multicoloured and erratic, shedding flares like the sun. She felt that it might be best to stay away from him. Something told her that he was contagious, whatever that meant. Still, she felt playful enough to buzz around in his face to see if he would notice her. He seemed annoyed, and after he put the boxes down, he swatted at her as though she was a fly. Delwyn freaked out when he picked up a can of fly spray, so she shot up high into the sky. It was like she was in a turbocharged elevator, as though someone had control of her. It wasn't like she was caged, but she was definitely controlled, as though someone wanted her to see something. She went so high that when she looked down, she couldn't see the earth. She knew that she was somewhere else. Something told her that she was in another dimension. When she looked down again, she thought she was seeing other planets, but they were more like bubbles or domes. Then something or someone told her telepathically that they were realms, like parallel universes. She flew down to the first one, which was the biggest, and was told that it was Earth, and that its true name was Alethea. Delwyn wasn't interested in exploring it as she was from there, and wanted to learn about the other realms. The next one was somehow connected to Alethea, existing in the same space but also independent of it. It was strange as it stretched on forever and encompassed everything, but was also separate. She was told that it was ether, the astral realm, and that she was in it. What was even stranger was that she could now see other astral bodies flying about, with their silver cords stretching out behind them, but they couldn't see her or each other. Delwyn could see them all and tried to communicate with them as they flew by her, but it was like she was invisible. She looked down to try to see her own silver cord, but she didn't have one. She started to panic, as she wondered if that meant that she was dead, but the telepathic voice said not to worry, she was different and that one day she would understand. She flew over to the realm that was parallel to Alethea. There was a twin realm on the other side, but she would explore that next. When she flew over to the first realm, she was excited to discover that it was one soul, the dreamland. She flew directly into it and was amazed to discover trillions of interconnected worlds within worlds inside one realm. What shocked her the most was that she saw creatures just like Varun, half human and half animal, in each world. She knew instantly what it meant, that everyone had a guide in the dream world, but then she became afraid of being discovered by Varun with that thought, so she quickly flew out and hovered outside one soul, trying to decide what to explore next. When she flew over to the realm on the other side of Aletheia, she was told that it was called Alusol, the land of hallucination. She thought about her narcoleptic episodes, and fear kept her away, since she didn't want to see what went on there. She already knew about nightmarish visions and decided that it might be best to avoid it. As she thought this, the telepathic voice told her that she might also want to avoid the realm that lay under Aletheia. It was known as Nidar, and that was where lost souls and dark thoughts resided. She agreed wholeheartedly and continued to explore the ether, escorted by the invisible entity who never introduced itself. She didn't mind, as she knew somehow that it was an element of her own intelligence. She was shown the level of Meditar, which was suspended between Aletheia and Akasha, as well as One Soul and Alusol, like a hub or station in the centre. It was the realm where meditating minds went. She was fascinated to also learn about the seven heavens that stretched above all these realms, and that to get there you had to elevate your soul and work your way through, much like studying and graduating through university. It was all to do with karma and how you lived your life and evolved. The most fascinating realm of all was Arankaran. It was the heaven for animal spirits. Delwyn learned how animals were actually above humans in the scheme of things, even though humans thought they were the most highly evolved. The voice explained how consciousness wasn't necessarily a measure of superiority and that spirituality was totally separate to it. The fact that humans had always assumed that they were superior to animals because of the idea of consciousness, they totally sidestepped spirituality, and that animals and plant life had consciousness. Not all humans had either or both of them. It was mind-boggling to Delwyn. Before she could go on, she heard the words, "How go you?" She couldn't see where they were coming from, and they kept getting louder and louder as they repeated, "How go you?" All of a sudden she was back in her body on her bed, dazed and lost. It took a long time to remember who and where she was. She jumped up and reached for her purple journal, but thought better of it and grabbed the white one. It had been the most incredible astral experience she'd ever had. She paid no mind to the fact that she was off her medication, but whatever the catalyst was, the information was so intriguing she had to record it. Gwen arrived back that afternoon with the argument somewhat lessened, but the brothers not speaking to each other. She found that Delwyn had stormed through and cleaned the house and was finishing with preparing their dinner. Gwen stood in the kitchen doorway, watching her niece racing around, taking pots off the stove top, grabbing condiments out of the fridge and slamming them onto the table, snatching plates out of the cabinet and throwing handfuls of napkins onto the plates. Delwyn was obviously manic, but at least she was making an effort. Gwen took her jacket off and went to the sink to wash her hands, nearly colliding with Delwyn, who was rushing to strain the potatoes. "Oh, I'm sorry, love," she sighed wearily, as it had been a long day and she'd insisted on helping Greg and Mark with the wood. "No, I'm sorry." Delwyn laughed and finished straining the vegetables, then proceeded to mash the potatoes. "I wanted to make you a nice dinner." Gwen took a napkin and wetted it, wiping her sweaty, sunburnt face. "Well, you've been busy. You didn't need to go to all this trouble." Delwyn stopped and wiped her hands on the apron. Her hair was wrapped up in a loose bun, with strands falling about her flushed face. "Well, I just felt bad about today. Anyway, I wanted to show you how much you're appreciated." "I know you appreciate me, Del. You don't have to make a big show." Gwen was tired and felt that even though she loved Delwyn, it had all been more than she'd bargained for. Now Mark and Greg were hardly speaking to each other, and she felt like she had to tread on eggshells in her own home. "It's no trouble, honestly," said Delwyn as she served up their meal and sat down, still hoping to make amends. Her mind was racing with the memory of her astral experience and the ramifications that entailed. She'd almost forgotten about the mirror. She beamed at Gwen like a child trying to appease a grumpy parent. "So, you'll be pleased to hear that I've decided to be more serious about Greg. He's a good guy and quite a catch, just like you said." Gwen rubbed her face with the palm of her hand and then took a sip of her water, trying to think of the right words. "Well, love, I don't know. After today and what happened between you and Mark, maybe it's not a good idea." She picked up a piece of carrot with her fork and took it to her lips, looking up to see Delwyn's face, falling into shock. "What do you mean?" Gwen put the carrot into her mouth and shrugged, trying to play it off as a small thing. "They're brothers, you know. Family. You don't want to cause a rift between them now, do you?" She chewed and watched her niece pout childishly. Delwyn pulled herself up in defiance, determined to have her way. "Greg is a grown man. He can make his own decisions. Besides, don't you want me to be happy?" She didn't touch her food as her temper was getting the better of her. Gwen shifted in her seat, prepared for the obvious onslaught. "Of course I want you to be happy, but I care for Greg and Mark too. The Eversons have always been like family to us. I feel that you're interested in Greg all of a sudden out of spite." Delwyn jumped up and burst into tears like a teenager, once again losing control. How Gwen was sick of her melodramatics. "Oh my God, so you're saying I'm shallow, is that it? I'm doing it to be spiteful, to hurt Mark? So that means I'm a nasty piece of work, playing games just to hurt people, is that it? Why don't you just say it? Just say it!" She glared through hot tears at her shocked aunt, who sat like a deer caught in the headlights of a truck, bearing down at 100 miles an hour. "Say what?" Gwen said finally, flabbergasted, with her hands upturned beseechingly. Delwyn screeched, "That I'm just like my mother!" She stomped off into her room and slammed the door behind her. Gwen was left speechless, sitting at the kitchen table, her eyes as wide as dinner plates, thinking to herself, what just happened? Delwyn threw herself on her bed and sobbed uncontrollably, with all the years of horrible memories flooding her mind. Her mother's taunts, her father's neglect, Duncan's disgust, and her mental afflictions all rolling into one giant snowball. Now her aunt was against her, and she was probably going to be thrown out, having to find some cheap rental or crappy motel and a horrible job. She thought about the mirror and, without thinking any further, launched herself out of the back door and raced down the steps, around the corner, through the bushes, slipping, falling and crying as she went. This time she was alone, as Peter was curled up in front of the fireplace, oblivious to the human drama playing out in the rest of the house. Gwen got up and put the dinner away and didn't even bother checking on Delwyn. She was tired of her crap and thought that she let her cry herself to sleep. In the morning they'd apologise to each other, but Gwen would give her one last ultimatum or she was out. She was nearly at her wit's end and had enough. Meanwhile, Delwyn was charging into the granny flat, slamming the door behind her once again, still crying and blubbering. She went to the mirror and pulled back the curtain, not caring about what would be on the other side. All she could think about was escaping from the real world and using her anger to finally face her biggest shadow. What she didn't know was that Mark had seen her racing into the flat, as he'd stayed behind to tidy up the wood heap for Gwen. He didn't think much of it, but decided to hang around to have one more go at Delwyn when she came back out of the flat. As soon as Delwyn barged through the mirror, she felt like hot pinpricks were piercing her skin all over her body. She screamed in terror, as even her nails, eyes and hair follicles were boiling like she was in a microwave oven being zapped in an instant. Her screams bounced off the walls of what seemed like a hospital ward, as the room was a blinding white that hurt to look at. So bright was the room that she couldn't make out any other features, such as furniture, doors or windows. She could only assume it was a room, as her echoing screams felt awfully close. It took a while for Delwyn to realise that the searing, burning pinpricks had stopped assailing her skin. She looked down at her arms, half expecting to see either blisters or blood, but saw neither. The tears and snot were starting to freeze on her face, so she pulled up her t-shirt and wiped it away, still trembling with anger and a little trepidation. She started walking around, arms outstretched, not knowing where the room started or ended. She called out, "Hello?" and a voice echoed closely but coldly like snowflakes gently drifting in the wind. She could hear something like small crystals being clinked together, but this time off in the distance. "Hello? Who's there?" she called out again, more snowflake sensations on her arms and face. Then she started running wildly here and there, not able to see, hands waving about frantically, trying to get either a hold on something or find a way out. The clinking crystal sound came closer and louder, and in the distance she thought she could see a shimmer or something shifting to the left. Delwyn's anger wasn't far from her, and she yelled this time, the snowflakes morphing into slender ice needles. "Who is it? I command you to show yourself!" She was surprised with how forceful she could be, even when gripped with terror. She saw the crystal outline of something forming in front of her in mid-air. It was transparent but had a rainbow sheen to it, like the colours on a bubble. It was snowing in the room now, and a blizzard was blowing all around her. The crystal clinking was ringing in her ears as the creature started materialising more fully in front of her. She backed away, suddenly aware that whatever it was might want to harm her. She screamed out, "Who are you?" The slender ice needles were now morphing into flying icicles that smashed against the creature without creating any damage. However, the debris flew back and cut into Delwyn's face and arms, leaving slender slits on the surface of her skin with thin trails of blood here and there. She gasped and stepped back, puffs of frozen clouds escaping from her lips. Then the hissing began, a frozen yet familiar sound, and the glassy creature finally became fully established, looming over her. It was Varun, twice his usual size and monstrous, with his icy blue eyes beaming down at her. Like an animated ice sculpture, he picked her up under both arms and lifted her high in the air. She screamed more icicles as his freezing webbed hands chilled her armpits and shoulders. His snorting see-through snout was in her face, and his clinking blue eyes glared angrily at her.
"How dare you rage in my world, stupid woman? How dare you rage?"
Frosted clouds billowed out of his mouth, directed into her face, which sealed her mouth shut. She tried to scream but couldn't move. He threw her for what seemed like miles across the room, and she landed against a huge white door piled up with snow. Delwyn's hands flew up to her mouth, but it was frozen over. She held her hands there, trying to melt the seal with their warmth as the clinking and hissing came closer and closer. Failing to melt the seal over her mouth, she scrambled to open the door, but it wouldn't budge. She looked over her shoulder and saw Varun bearing down on her, his blue eyes buzzing with electricity.
"Running, running, running, always running. Where is your rage now, Delwyn?"
His laughter hissed in her ears and penetrated her brain like hot pokers. Her hands were slipping all over the wet, round door handle as the muffled screams chilled her insides. Slowly but surely she was freezing from the inside out, and her chilled hands were having difficulty trying to grip the handle. When she turned around again, Varun was directly behind her, his body completely ice blue.
"Where do you think you're going, stupid girl?"
He unfurled his seahorse tail, and it transformed into a gleaming trident, preparing to strike it into her hopeless flesh. Doing her best not to scream again, she turned to the door and pushed with all her might. Mercifully, it gave way, and she crashed through and tumbled into darkness. She thought quickly and jumped up, slamming the door behind her. She was good at that. All of a sudden, she realised that her mouth was not frozen over any more. but that she still had the cuts on her arms and face. She could feel the blood drying on her skin, but she felt safe for now. She looked around and saw that she was in a foyer, and it was oddly familiar. As she strained her eyes, the house lit up, but she became sick to her stomach. It couldn't be. But it was what she'd threatened. It was what she'd said she would do. She was in her childhood home. It was her mother's house. She heard Varun somewhere in the distance, chuckling maniacally, with the crystal clinking and hissing as backdrop. Even though fear was gripping and twisting her soul, her temper was still fired up, and she knew that this was something that had to be done. She slowly started walking out of the foyer through the dark hallway towards the living room. Everything was exactly the same as when she was a child. She went over to the closet and touched the notch in the frame, the one that she'd done with a knife when she was 14, just to see if her mother would notice. She never had, and it had been a small triumph for Delwyn all her life. She zigzagged across the hallway looking at various objects such as the paintings and etchings, the sideboard with the white roses her mother placed every day, the coat rack and the entrance that led to the staircase. When she got to the living room, she stopped and looked around, wondering where her mother was. She was perplexed as to why she was so calm. Everything there was the same too. It was always funny to Delwyn that even though a living room was always so inviting and warm, it was the stage for a cold-hearted walking corpse who liked to torture anyone who ventured into it. She went over and traced her finger along the leather couch and picked up the soft cashmere blanket lying over the back. She'd never been allowed to touch it, but she defiantly snuggled into it now, realizing the symbolism of it, the warmth of motherhood or love. She saw that the fire was crackling nicely in the large open fireplace and walked over and sat down on the ottoman in front of it, stretching out her legs and defrosting her frozen limbs. She was impressed with her apparent lack of fear and looked around the room at the different things she'd forgotten about. There was the giant bookcase with the first editions only. Next to that was the crystal cabinet, which gleamed with Staffordshire bric-a-brac. How Delwyn had always longed to take an axe to it. She looked over at the nest of turtle-shell-covered tables and plush recliners. There had never been a TV in their house, as her mother had found it crude and debauched, and had said that it rotted the brain. There was an expensive stereo unit against the other wall, with a shelving unit full of records and CDs stacked neatly, organised in alpha order according to genre and artist or composer. She went over to it and pulled out an album or CD here and there. Beethoven, Debussy, Chopin, never Mozart. According to her mother, he was an idiot, even though Delwyn had loved him. She was reading the cover of a Peer Gynt record when she felt the hair on her neck prickle uncomfortably. "Put that down!" Delwyn knew that it was her mother behind her, or rather an echo or composite, or whatever the dream world or one soul created as a shadow. She thought for a minute and wondered if she should put it down. She wanted to face her finally, but as long as she had her back to her, the courage was relatively stable. She slowly slid the record back into the shelf and continued fingering the records and CDs, wondering what would happen next. There were no footsteps, but the presence was closer now. "Stop touching my things!" The voice was exactly the same. It was bone-chilling and cut the air like a sharp blade. Delwyn's hands trembled, but she continued touching them, occasionally pulling a CD or record out to look at it. Now she heard a few chilling footsteps on the hardwood floor directly behind her, the familiar clickety-clack of her mother's high heels closing in as the voice seethed into the back of her head. "I said, stop touching my things, you stupid, useless girl!" Her mother hung on to the last letter of the word girl, like she couldn't let go of the word or the verbal attack. Without turning around, Delwyn slid over to the couch and grabbed the cashmere blanket, running to the fire and spinning around triumphantly to see her mother still standing at the shelving unit. The sight of her froze Delwyn to the spot, as it was so real that she was teleported right back to her childhood. Her mother wasn't a caricature like the first time she'd seen her, with the black ice tentacles. She was flesh and blood, but still as thin as a rail, gaunt and juiceless. She was wearing her favourite outfit, an expensive white shift dress with matching jacket and pearls, and white low-heel pumps. Her tight black hair, close to her skull, which had always seemed too afraid to grow, was almost like a well-fitted suction cup. Her stark makeup and slash of a red mouth was a sneer to the world. "You've soiled my blanket," she said, snarling at Delwyn, disgusted and crossing her arms across her bony chest. Delwyn clutched it tighter and decided that she wasn't going to allow this to be drawn out. "I'm not afraid of you," her voice came out, cracked and thin, not as convincing as she had hoped. Her mother let out a nasty cackle and wrinkled her manicured nose at her. "Of course you are. You're always afraid, always running, frightened little mouse, little rat, little maggot." She spat the words at her so full of hatred. Delwyn felt the years of pain and fear well up in her chest, but she didn't want to let it consume her. She didn't want to collapse in front of her mother yet again. She was slowly but surely forgetting that it wasn't real. Or was it? She was confused and hurt, but as her mother started slowly making her way around the couch towards her, she yelled, "Don't come any closer!" Her mother didn't listen, but continued creeping, saying, "Why not? It's my house, not yours, little maggot." Delwyn started sidestepping towards the hall, hyperventilating now. "Get away! Stop it! Stop it!" She fell over, still gripping the blanket, and started crawling past the bookcase as her mother's footsteps came closer. "Yes, that's it. Crawl on the floor, little maggot, fat little worm. Wriggle around in the grime and filth, you scum. Worthless maggot! Crawl away, maggot!" Her mother was seething with venom, but Delwyn didn't look back. She continued crawling and crying along the wall until she got to the hallway and kept crawling. She was sobbing and blubbering uncontrollably as her mother called out all the horrible names she could dredge up. It wasn't until she got past the entrance to the stairway that she heard the white monster from her hypnopompic episode saying in her head, "You'll regret it." She knew that she would, so she stopped and turned around, still on the ground, sitting cross-legged with the blanket in her lap. Her mother was at the end of the hallway, and Delwyn gasped at the transformation. She was no longer pristine in her white dress. She was barefoot and covered in blood, her dress tattered and dirty. All around her on the floor were the torn-up bodies of babies and children. She had a small arm in her hand, and she was chewing on it ferociously like a wild, starved beast. Delwyn couldn't help but scream out, "No!" Her mother's hair was long and stringy, dripping with blood. She jerked her head around, and Delwyn saw that her long, jagged teeth were also dripping with blood. A slender, forked tongue slithered out of her mouth, and she snarled at Delwyn. She dropped the arm and then levitated 2 feet off the ground. Delwyn gasped as a light from somewhere above shone down on her mother, giving her a halo effect. She knew that this was it. She had to face her and accept her for who and what she was. Somebody or something had made her mother like this. There was nothing more to do, no more running. She slowly opened up her arms to her, hesitating at first, but then she flung them out, telling herself, "This is it." She heard Varun somewhere saying, "Yes, yes." Her mother started floating towards her, teeth gnashing and dark eyes glaring at her. She also put her arms out towards Delwyn and was making growling animal noises, the blood still dripping from her jagged teeth. As she got closer and closer, Delwyn started shaking and hyperventilating again, her heart barely beating, but she kept her arms out firmly, waiting for whatever would happen. When her mother got to her, Delwyn could smell death and saw the horror face to face. She nearly fainted with the terror of it, but then, in a flash, her mother was back to normal and sobbing in her arms. She was crying and begging for forgiveness, burying her face in Delwyn's shoulder. Delwyn threw the blanket around her mother and hugged her, rocking back and forth, saying soothing words to calm her. She started crying again and saw the light now over both of them. They were bathed in golden light, and she was serene for the first time in a long time. She smelled sandalwood, and her eyes were closed for what seemed like ages. When she finally opened them, she was on her own, still on the floor of the hallway with the cashmere blanket. She didn't have any cuts on her arms or face any more. When she looked up again, she saw Varun hovering in the light. He was golden now, with white eyes, and he was smiling at her. "Ah, finally," he said in a soft voice, clapping his webbed hands together and shaking his head with happiness. "You did it, Delwyn. You faced your shadow, the biggest one anyway." Delwyn smiled and said, "Phew." They both laughed and he helped her up. "So what now?" she asked, ready for anything. He led her back through the door to the white room, which was now just like a waiting room in a hospital, with chairs and windows. The beautiful lady was there behind the desk with a name tag on her smock that read Delwyn. Her long black hair was around her shoulders and she was on the telephone. She winked and waved at Delwyn, then gave her a big thumbs up. "Who is she? Is she me?" Delwyn asked. "Who do you think?" Varun replied. "My anima, or my female side," she said. "Or an archetype of all women. How you see women and how you are. It all depends on the dreamer." He smiled with his eyes. "But am I dreaming?" she asked, a little sad. "I hope not." "Why?" she asked, confused. He sighed and had already brought her back to the mirror. "Well, if you are dreaming, then this isn't real. And to answer your first question," he led her through the mirror to a beautiful scene. She thought it might be in Sweden or the Arctic. It was her mountain, tall and majestic, snow-capped and magical. Oh, my mountain!" she squealed, grabbing Varun to hug him. He stuttered, saying, all right, enough. Yes, it's your mountain. It means that you are on your way to being integrated. I wanted to show it to you." "Oh, it's beautiful." "Yes, it is. But you must go back to Alethea. There's some mortal business to attend to." "Mortal?" He grabbed Delwyn by the shoulders and said gravely, "Delwyn, you just proved to me and yourself that you can be brave and strong, correct?" She didn't like the sound of what might be coming. "Yes, but why do I feel like I'm about to be slapped with a fish?" He laughed and gripped her tighter. "Your sense of humour will keep you sane, I should hope." He released her from his grip but grabbed her hand. "This will be the last time you come to One Soul for a while." She spun around to face him. She was shocked. "What? Why?" Tears came to her eyes, and he reached out his hand and stroked her hair tenderly, as a father would. "You have some trials to go through in Alethea, Delwyn, but chin up, my dear. It is all necessary in the scheme of things." She jerked away from him. "I don't understand," she said, crying again. He shushed her, looking this way and that to make sure they weren't being listened to. "When you come back, it will be under different circumstances," he said conspiratorially. "You see, this was a testing ground. You had to get this baggage out of the way. Once properly integrated, you will be able to achieve your true destiny." Delwyn stopped crying, as she was baffled with it all. "Which is what?" she said, sniffing and wiping her face with her t-shirt. He leaned in even closer and said, "A portal stormer." She gave him a look of disbelief and said, "Portal stormer?" He pulled his head back and said with a snort, "Yes, actually." "And what exactly is a portal stormer?" She couldn't believe that she was asking such a ludicrous question, but then again she was in the dreamland, talking to a creature who was half man, half seahorse. Varun brought her back to the mirror and said flatly, "Someone who can traverse all realms, such as yourself. It's very rare to find someone who can travel astrally, although a lot of humans do it nowadays. There are a lot of people who hallucinate, but the majority of them do it via chemical assistance or imbalance.
You do both on your own, and very well, so I hear. But to dream lucidly and to be able to enter a portal to one soul in physical form? That makes you a bona fide portal stormer." He looked her up and down as though he was having second thoughts. "Although you do whine and cry a lot, also you complain a lot. You will have a lot of growing up to do, as there's so much going on in the realms that you know nothing about. And we need your help. We've never had a human portal stormer before." Delwyn was standing there with her mouth open, not knowing where to begin, but there wasn't any time. Varun grabbed her by the chin and said, "I will see you on your return. Remember, my girl, courage." With that, he pushed her through the mirror, and she found herself on the other side in the flat. She stood there, staring into the mirror in shock, when suddenly she heard something rustling in the bushes outside. She turned her head to see Mark staring at her through the window.